You're at a gathering where one man dominates every conversation, his voice filling every silence, his opinions spraying like a broken fire hydrant. He interrupts others mid-sentence, circles back to his own stories, treats dialogue like a monologue with reluctant participants. Everyone knows this man, and everyone knows what he's hiding. Arthur Schopenhauer identified this compulsion with surgical precision. He understood that excessive talking is not a sign of confidence, but its opposite, a desperate attempt to construct a self through words because no solid self exists in reality. The weak man talks because silence would reveal his emptiness. The philosopher called this the metaphysics of verbal incontinence. When someone lacks internal substance, they must create external noise to maintain the illusion of existence. They talk not to communicate, but to convince themselves they matter, using words like scaffolding around a building that was never built. I watched this pattern destroy a talented executive named Brian. In every meeting, he spoke twice as long as anyone else, explaining simple concepts in elaborate detail, narrating his every thought process, turning 5-minute updates into 20-minute dissertations. He thought he was demonstrating intelligence and leadership. His team saw something else entirely. They recognized his torrents of words as what Schopenhauer would call existential panic, the terror of a man who suspected that if he stopped talking, he might cease to exist. His verbosity wasn't strength, but a symptom of profound weakness. Think about the strongest men you know. They speak deliberately, sometimes sparingly. Their words have weight because they're rare. They can tolerate silence because they're not using conversation to prop up a fragile ego. Their presence speaks, therefore, they don't need to. Schopenhauer observed that weak men talk too much because they're trying to control reality through description. If they can narrate everything, explain everything, define everything verbally, they feel momentarily powerful. But this power is illusion. The world continues independent of their commentary. Consider James, a middle manager who responded to every email with paragraphs, held meetings that always ran over, and couldn't give simple yes or no answers. When pressed about a decision, he'd launch into historical context, potential ramifications, tangential anecdotes, anything to avoid the vulnerability of taking a clear position. James talked so much because he had no center from which to speak. Without core beliefs, genuine expertise, or authentic self-knowledge, he had to manufacture authority through volume. He confused being heard with being respected, noise with knowledge, words with wisdom. This compulsion reveals what Schopenhauer called the horror vacui of personality, the terror of empty space. Weak men cannot tolerate silence because silence forces confrontation with their own psychological vacuum. They must fill every gap with words like, "Someone terrified of the dark must fill every room with light." I knew a consultant named David who exemplified this perfectly. Client calls that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to an hour. He'd repeat points multiple times, explain concepts nobody questioned, provide context nobody needed. He thought he was being thorough. He was actually broadcasting insecurity. The tell was that David's talking increased proportionally to his uncertainty. When he knew something deeply, he could be concise. But when he was guessing, improvising, or insecure, the words multiplied exponentially, a verbal smokescreen hiding the absence of substance. Schopenhauer understood that excessive talking is fundamentally about control, not controlling others, but controlling one's own anxiety. Each word is a small ward against the fear of being found out, of being seen as inadequate, of being revealed as ordinary. The weak man talks too much because he's performing confidence rather than embodying it. He's describing the person he wishes he was rather than being that person. His words are costume jewelry, creating the appearance of wealth while revealing poverty to anyone who looks closely. This principle extends beyond individuals to entire cultures. Schopenhauer noticed that declining civilizations become increasingly verbose. Endless laws, regulations, explanations for why things aren't working. Strength speaks simply. Weakness requires elaborate justification. I witnessed this with a startup founder named Michael, whose company was failing. As the situation worsened, his investor updates grew longer. What started as one-page summaries became 10-page essays, filled with market analysis, competitor discussions, future projections, everything except the simple truth that the business model didn't work. Michael couldn't say "we're failing" in 3 words because that would require strength he didn't have. So he buried the truth under thousands of words, hoping volume would obscure reality. His investors saw through it immediately. Verbosity is weakness's signature. Schopenhauer identified another aspect. Weak men talk too much because they're addicted to reaction. Every word is a fishing line cast for validation, disagreement, any response that confirms their existence. They need others' reactions like addicts need fixes, and talking is how they get their supply. The strong man doesn't need your reaction. He speaks when necessary, then returns to silence. Your agreement or disagreement doesn't affect his reality. He's not fishing for validation because he's not hungry for what you might provide. Consider romantic relationships. The weak man narrates his feelings constantly, processes every emotion verbally, needs to discuss the relationship endlessly. He thinks he's being communicative. He's actually being needy. His excessive words reveal that he doesn't trust the relationship to exist without constant verbal reinforcement. The strong man's love doesn't require constant articulation. He shows through action, speaks when words add value, remains silent when presence suffices. His partner never doubts his feelings because they're evident in his being, not dependent on his describing. I knew a professor named Richard who could lecture for hours without notes, filling every second with words. Students initially impressed by his apparent knowledge soon realized he was essentially saying nothing, just verbal patterns creating the illusion of content, sound, and fury, signifying nothing. Compare him to his colleague, Professor Chen, who spoke perhaps half as much, but whose every sentence carried meaning. Students hung on his words because they were chosen, not compulsive. His silences were as educational as his speech because they gave space for understanding to develop. Schopenhauer's insight penetrates even deeper. He understood that weak men talk too much because they're trying to think out loud, having never developed the capacity for internal dialogue. They need to hear themselves speak to know what they think, using others as mirrors for their own confusion. The strong man thinks before he speaks, sometimes choosing not to speak at all. His thoughts are processed internally, refined, clarified before expression. When he speaks, he's sharing conclusions, not performing the messy process of reaching them. This explains why weak men often contradict themselves within the same conversation. They're not lying. They're discovering their thoughts through speech, and those thoughts are inconsistent because they lack a solid core from which consistent thoughts emerge. I watched this with a politician who gave 40-minute answers to simple questions, circling around positions without landing, testing different arguments to see which resonated. His verbosity revealed not complexity of thought, but absence of conviction. The prescription Schopenhauer offers isn't to simply talk less. That's just another performance. It's to develop the inner substance that makes excessive talking unnecessary. Build genuine expertise, cultivate real convictions, develop authentic self-knowledge. When you have something solid inside, you don't need words to create the illusion of substance. The practice begins with tolerating silence. In your next conversation, resist the urge to fill pauses. When asked a question, pause before answering. When you've made your point, stop. Don't elaborate, don't repeat, don't seek confirmation through continued explanation. Notice the discomfort. That discomfort is your weakness wanting to hide behind words. Sit with it. Let it teach you where you're using speech as a crutch, where you're performing rather than being. This week, practice what Schopenhauer called verbal economy. Use the minimum words necessary. Make your point once. Answer the question asked, not the dissertation you'd prefer to give. Stop explaining when explanation isn't requested. Watch how others respond. Initially, they might be confused. They're used to your verbal excess. But soon they'll start listening more carefully because your words have become valuable through scarcity. More importantly, watch what happens inside you. Without words to hide behind, you're forced to confront your own substance or lack thereof. This confrontation is uncomfortable but necessary. It's the difference between seeming and being. Schopenhauer's ultimate message is that weak men talk too much because they're trying to talk themselves into existence. But existence doesn't come from words. It comes from being. The strong man speaks little because he is much. The weak man speaks much because he is little. Your assignment isn't to become silent, but to become substantial. Develop the inner weight that makes excessive words unnecessary. Build the genuine confidence that doesn't require verbal performance. Cultivate the authentic self that exists independent of others' recognition. When you have genuine substance, your words become powerful through selectivity. When you have real strength, silence becomes comfortable. When you have authentic self, you don't need to describe it. It simply is, and everyone knows it. The question isn't whether you talk too much. If you're wondering, you probably do. The question is whether you're using words to hide weakness, or ready to develop the strength that makes most words unnecessary.